Good Tavach, welcome to tonight's Shir, Motzei Shabbos Parshas Vayeshev, which was Shabbos Mevorchim Teves, and today's Shir is dedicated kindly by Reb Pinchas Rabin and family in honor of the newborn grandson, Mordechai Osher ben Moshe Cheskel Rabin. So parents should be Megadol him, the Torah Chuppah Matan Tovim, and the grandparents should have lots of nachas, Leach Yom Shalom Teves. I'm going to share with you the statistics before we go into the actual shear, but I think people would be happy to see the statistics of the shear. This is from the, as you can see, for the last year. So have an 112% growth. This is on Spotify alone. And we have here 1.4 thousand listening hours and new audience 487%. I don't understand all these statistics, but Baruch Hashem. And I want to say that the people who are listening on Motzei Shabbos are the nucleus for this shir, and so thank you for joining us. And right, let's go to our shir. So the first thing I want to share with you is, since I had a request to include a Siddur Shemaisa, so I want to accommodate that request. I also want to accommodate another request to make a siyum on Rambam as we finish each sefer. So the story which I want to share with you is the following. Last week was Parshas Vayishlach. That means just this morning. I mean a week before, and we have a shliach in Oslo by the name of Rabbi Shoel Wilhelm. So his father took him to New York to the Rebbe, and Shoel was all of 6 years old. And it was common for the Rebbe to ask younger children to ask him about tzitzis. So his father prepped him with what to answer about tzitzis. But as it was, when they came, they were told by Rabbi Groner or whoever, there's going to be a while till they come in, till they have their slot for Yechidas. So father took the son downstairs, and they learned the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, which was this time of the year. Learned with them the child, the Chumash, and the bit of the Rashi, and then they go into Yechidas, and then the Rebbe asks the young boy, "What's the week Sedra?" So he knew to say it's Parshas Vayishlach. And did you know what it says in the Sedra? Yeah, the Rebbe asks him, and so what does Vayishlach mean? And then Yaakov sends Malachim. So what does Malachim mean? So he says it means Malachim Mamash, and that's what Rashi says. And the Rebbe says to him, "Vozokstu." But what's your take when you see that Yaakov sent Malachim? How do you understand? And Shaul, as a 6-year-old boy, didn't have what to answer. But the point which he found this very pertinent. That the Rebbe is saying to a young child, I know you've learned Rashi, but now kind of digest this and think in your own mind whether you absorb this and how to absorb this, etc. Now this brings me to the siyum of Sefer Kinyan in Rambam, and a very, should we say, a very modern, contemporary kind of approach, where although we're talking about slaves, and although mitzad hadin, you are allowed to really make them work back-breaking labor, and yet midas chasidus is that a person should be compassionate, and he should not be too overbearing on his slaves. He should feed them for him generously from whatever he has. And then he has a quote from Eov. First he has a pasuk, Keinek Shivchel Yad Gevirto, the pasuk from Tehillim, but then he has that Eov talks about, did I despise the justice for my servants? Haloi bebeten oiseni oisahu. He was made in the same womb as I was made, In other words, the equality of human beings, that they are human and we are human, and therefore, although there is a hierarchy, there is a business arrangement of them being slaves, and yet to respect them as human beings. So that's so I just see that a little bit similar. You have a Rebbe speaking to a child, and it's a message for all of us. It's a child, yes, you're so much older, I'm so much more educated, and the child is less so, and yet to respect that child's view and ask was too. So that's what I want to share these two in Yonah. Okay, so now let's go on to our list of questions. So here's the first question. Lubavitcher Chassid, he has a spare pair of tefillin at home, and he gets up early and puts on tefillin at home to say Shema. And then he takes them off, probably has a bit of bison, something to eat, something to have energy for davening, and then he goes subsequently to shul, and he puts on another pair, different pair of tefillin in shul. So does he need to make a new bracha on the tefillin which he puts on in shul? So what you have on the screen here is from the Hoysofas, from the Miluim of the Siddur, which I was zeicher to publish, and there's a whole chapter here in the Miluim about brachas in when you've changed from one thing to the other. So we have here from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, someone went from one sukkah to another, and the Alter Rebbe says he has to make a new bracha on when he goes into the second sukkah, even though he doesn't need to make a new bracha on the food, but the fact he's gone to a different sukkah, he has to make a new bracha. So it seems to be because it's a different article. And this is particularly interesting. In 770, as you may know, there's the yard at the side of 770, between 770 and the Rebbe's library, and there is a bridge between the two buildings. And that's where the sukkah is built every year, in this yard. And so you have the yard going from the front all the way to the back of that yard. And in between, you have this bridge, which is, I don't know, 8 feet, 10 feet wide. At any rate, you got both sukkahs are they're not the same sukkah. And this is a very practical question. If someone made a bracha leishiv sukkah in the front part of the sukkah, and then he decides that the farbrengen at the far end looks more attractive, and so does he have to make another time leishiv sukkah when he goes? It's within the mamish the same four walls, broadly speaking, but it's another sukkah. So that's a discussion, and I'm sure the Rabbanim and Crown Heights have addressed this. I've looked into it once, but I'm not going to deal with it now. So you have this idea that going from one sukkah to the other requires a new bracha. So there is a sefer called Beis Meir, who was around the time of the Alter Rebbe, perhaps a little earlier, and he disagrees with this, and he says it's the same mitzvah. What's the difference? This sukkah, that sukkah, it's all the same mitzvah. But the Alter Rebbe clearly takes the view that the fact that you are moving from one sukkah to a different sukkah, then you have to make a new bracha leishiv sukkah. It's a new article of a mitzvah. And on that basis, switching sukkah to sukkah warrants a new bracha. So similarly, switching tefillin to tefillin warrants a new bracha. Now, having said so, there are those the one who challenged my friend has got some background, as I said, first of all, the Beis Meir, and this is from the Sefer Piskei Teshuvos, who quotes that that if when you take off one pair of tefillin, you have in mind to put on another pair of tefillin. For example, you turned up to shul and you realize you don't have your tefillin, so you borrow someone's tefillin. But what you have made arrangements that someone's going to bring your tefillin, and likely the owner of these tefillin is going to come sooner or later. You're going to take them off and put on your own tefillin. Gives it such an example. So he says that if there wasn't a hesach hadas, or if you didn't leave the premises, then you wouldn't make another bracha. So I'm not sure I'm not totally sure about this, if it's mamish without hafsaka at all. But what I did say to the fellow is that you are going from your home to shul. That is already a hefsek called shini mokim. Is a hefsek. In addition, if you go to mikveh in between, and if you use the facilities in between, all of these would be create a hefsek between the first mitzvah and the second one, and therefore that would justify making a new bracha. I just want to finish off this point and say that I believe the majority of our Anash are accustomed to not make a bracha on the talus cotton in the morning and wait with the bracha until you put on your talus for davening, and then you have in mind the talus, also the talus cotton. Now, it's discussed in Hayom Yom. It's a little bit ambiguous. And I know of a couple of eminent Talmidei Chachamim who insist on that's not that you should put on when you should make a bracha on your talus cotton in the morning when you get dressed, and then again on the talus later on. So I don't have a solid case one way or the other. But what I'm seeing here, according to this svara, which we're reading now, that there is a svara that the bracha on the earlier tefillin should cover for the later tefillin. So there's also, according to that at least according to the other poskim, there is room to say that the bracha on the tzitzis would cover for the talis. And don't bother about the fact that it's a different nusach, whether this is al mitzvah tzitzis and this is al asatev tzitzis, because those details are not in ma'akev. Okay, let's move on to our next thing, and that is that I was on duty on the Beis Haroah last week, and someone calls up that they have some kind of skin issue he has on his leg, and he needs to wash it with a shower. Now, he's not going to use hot water. We're talking about Shabbos. Not going to use hot water, but using a shower, if you don't have a curtain in the way, is going to create a puddle on the floor. So that's why if you want to use a shower, you usually want to use some kind of curtain or partition to contain the water inside the shower tray or the bath. He's asking that his shower curtain is made of polyester. Is that an issue of soaking the curtain with a shower? Now, it probably is not a problem because the polyester curtains for showers are probably made with a layer of some kind of waterproofing that they shouldn't absorb. Not much use of having an absorbent shower curtain. It doesn't sound very clever unless you want to develop mold. But taking a look here, just generally, if it were, let's say, is a terraline tablecloth, is wetting that considered washing? So there is a certain view that the real schita and kibbutz only applies to wool or cotton or linen, natural fibers. But it doesn't apply to nylon or plastic, etc. But that's where I was not so convinced. And that's why you can see here also the Piskei Teshuvos talks about this. I think it's in Simon base, that when you've made a weave with synthetic fibers, so then that should be seen as the same as had it been woven with natural fibers. In other words, when it says in halacha that something like leather is not it doesn't it's not a problem of kibbutz of washing of laundering, that's when it's a sheet of leather. And the same thing if we're a sheet of plastic. A sheet of plastic, it's gotten dirty, you are allowed to pour water on it, although you shouldn't rub it between your hands. That's what it says in the Mishnah in reference to leather. But that's when it's just a plain sheet of which is non-absorbent. But when we have something, he shows here acrylion, terraline, etc. He refers here to the Teshuvos Or L'Tzion, that's from Rebbe Tzion Abba Shaul, and also to others, Shevet HaLevi and Chut Shoni, where they say that yes, nylon is waterproof, but if you take nylon and make it into threads, then it would be absorbent to some degree. And therefore, the limitations of soaking equaling laundry on Shabbos would apply to synthetic fibers too. Besides the fact that sometimes, very often, the synthetic fibers, that material may be sewn, the hem, a seam, and the stitching may be well done with cotton. And so then you've got the problem of kibbutz from that alone. So coming back, I recommended to him that he has just a plain plastic curtain, which he was happy to go ahead. You have just a plain, smooth plastic curtain, and then there's no shiloh at all. Right. We're going on to the next question, and that is there an issue of pouring boiling water from a of kettle into a meaty cholent? So the meaty cholent has got a vapor. When you open it up, it's hot, so it's got a meaty vapor, and now you're pouring with the kettle into it. Is there an issue here of the meaty vapor affecting the power of status of that kettle? So what you have on the screen is from Reb Shlomo Zalman in Auerbach in Minchas Shlomo. He says the following: you should be careful. Here's a question: pouring water from a kettle to a fleshik dish, fleshik food which is being cooked. So he says you should be careful that the vapor which is coming up from the pot, from the cholent, let's say, which is coming to reaching the kettle, should not be yad ledesbe. Should be set. It should be in a way that if you put your hand there, you wouldn't have to withdraw your hand quickly. If it's not yad ledesbe, if the lower pot, the steam coming up, is not going to be so hot, even if the kettle is still, so let's say it's a Shabbos kettle sitting on the fire, and you open the spout, but since it's you got here, indeed there may be some vapor, but he's not so worried about it. So typically, if you wanted to, let's say, top up hot water to a drying out cholent, and you wanted to put it directly under the tap of the urn, if you'd hold the cholent that little bit lower, not directly beneath the tap, but a little bit lower, in a way that if any vapor comes up, it's not going to be yad ledesbe, then that won't affect the power of status of your kettle, the spout of your kettle. And what about the fact that there's a water connection, that the hot water is connecting from the upper to the lower? Is there an upstream taste being transferred? So you got water pouring from the kettle into the cholent. Is there a svara that there's going to be some fleshik taste going upstream from the cholent into the kettle? So he says the Chochmas Odom addresses this. If the lower one was hot and the upper one was cold, then yes, then the heat may travel up. If both of them are hot, then you're not going to have that dynamic, so it's not a worry. So that's useful to know, that pouring from a kettle, part of a kettle, into an active fleshik hot food, if you should hold the kettle far enough that there shouldn't be hot steam coming up from the fleshik food, which would reach the kettle whilst it's still hot. Let's move on to our next question. Is gluten-free, someone asks, is a gluten-free dough subject to challah? Now, we have to be careful, because I did check online about gluten-free flours, and generally gluten-free, now this is that wheat and other grains have in them a natural stickiness. And there are people who suffer from celiac or other conditions, which they struggle with digesting the gluten stuff, and hence they go to gluten-free foods. So when you see a gluten-free food, it may well be made out of nuts. Gluten-free flour. It's many times it's made from other species and rather than from wheat. But if you can look carefully, it says here premium wheat based. And so Don't ask me the details, but apparently there's a chemical way of removing. There's a way of chemically removing the gluten out of the flour, and this is our question. So again, if it were gluten-free, not from the five species of grain as wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye, then there would be no question of hafroshes challah. But this is indeed it's made from wheat, apparently, and yet it doesn't have any gluten in it. So is it subject to hafroshes challah? So this is an interesting point that this is actually from Hilchos Pesach, and it says here that you would not fulfill the mitzvah of matzah on Pesach with matzah made only of the bran, because that would not qualify as bread for challah. And it's kind of there's the same rules for challah and for matzah, for the mitzvah of matzah, and apparently, at least according to some, there seems to be a machlokas poskim. I looked around. Some poskim say that it's only subject to mitzvahs challah if it could ferment and become chometz, but the gluten-free flour apparently will not ferment, and therefore it's it's not valid for matzah, and accordingly also not valid for challah. So again, some poskim will say it's from wheat, so therefore it's subject to challah. Other poskim would say that it because it is conditioned, it's not going to become chometz ever. Therefore, it doesn't have to have taken challah. So the bottom line would be from such a product to be mafresh challah, but without saying a bracha when doing so, because it's a suffix. Okay, I'm going to go into this lip stain, and forgive me for not putting any pictures of this product, but I did look it up, part of my job. And so apparently it's the following. There's a kind of lip, uh, well, stain means a paint of some sort, which is put on the lips, and then it's left to dry for a few minutes. And the actual stain doesn't look very appealing, but then it looks more black than anything else. But then it's peeled off. It becomes like two layers. The upper layer becomes like a film, which you're able to peel off, and then the lower layer remains stuck to the lip, and that looks the color which the person desires or thinks they're going to be more attractive that way. So here's an interesting question. Is it eligible? Sorry, is it permitted to peel this upper layer off on Shabbos? So actually, I did not see it as a problem. So to put on the stain on Shabbos, definitely not. You're not allowed to use colored makeup. For that matter, even to use clear lip gloss. It's also Shmiras Shabbos says not to use. It's enhancing the color. But here, the color has been placed there already. It's just that it's under wraps. It's got this upper layer. Removing that layer is not a problem. I don't see why it should be a problem. And it's there only for temporary. Therefore, I don't see it as a problem to peel it off. Not that I'm recommending it to be used, and I'm not getting any commission from any cosmetics company, but strictly speaking, in halacha, I see it's okay. Okay, now we're going on to question number 6, and if you may remember that we had a discussion about Kodesh, Kodesh, Kodesh. Why is there a vertical line after the first word Kodesh? And I'd looked around, eventually found this in the Siddur of Reb Shabsi Sofer. And so one of our listeners listens to the recording. He says, perhaps you can help us also with the word Echad. In Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Look in the Siddur. Before the word Echad, there's a vertical line. So he's asking perhaps that Sefer will also help us with this one too. And he was actually right. So here you have. And just to remind you, the word, is it posek or posik? Well, this is referring to this line. It's not a trop. It doesn't have a tune, but it's one of the symbols which help the reading of the text, similar to what the hyphen, which is called in Lashon Kodesh, is called the makaf. So it has no trop, but it does help us manage the understand where to put the pause, not to put the pause, and so on. So here, this vertical line, this posek, doesn't have a trop, but it is there for a reason. So he's asking, why is there this reason? Now, to remind you who Rav Shabbos Sefer is, he's a Talmud of the Baal Halavushim of Rav Mordechai Yafo, lives about 400 years ago, was highly, highly recommended by the Vada Barotzis for his mastery in Dikduk, and they wanted every community to have a copy of his Siddur, which he published. The manuscript, which we have published over here, was kept in manuscript for about, I say, about 400 years. It was owned by the London Beis Din, and it was published about 30 years ago. Fascinating. Goes through kind of all of these little, we call the Yiddish pitchivkis, all these little questions in how you spell things, etc. And so here he addresses why is there that line. So he says the following. We have in Shema Yisrael, in the Pasuk Shema Yisrael, we have Hashem Elokeinu Hashem. I've got Hashem addressed 3 times. And there is, each one of those has got a different, referring to a different aspect. As he refers to the Zohar and the Rakanati in Parshas Va'aschanan, where the Pasuk is, who is about Rav Nachman Rakanati was a famous Makubal. And then he refers to Tzelas Yaakov, who wrote a commentary on the Siddur. And when he talks about the Shema, that the Hashem, Elokeinu Hashem, each of those are referring to a different level. I'm sure in Chassidus there's also a lot of similar kind of discussion. Now, if it hadn't been that line, you would have said Hashem, Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. The third one, that's the real one. And that obviously is very wrong. And because Echad refers to all, although we talk about different dargas, different levels in godliness, but ultimately it's all Hashem Echad, it's all one. And therefore, there is that line to say Echad is referring to all of the above, rather than just to the last word. So that's what the line is there for. If someone can help me, I don't know what this word over here, Pirud v'kitzutz chas v'shalom. You have very often this term, if someone says something which is misleading in fundamental in yonim of faith, they have the loshon is koitzitz binatiyos, as if he is kind of picking at the plants. I'm not sure why that euphemism is used for saying the wrong thing about godliness. If someone knows, I'll be grateful what the loshon comes from. I did not do too much homework about that. Just giving that challenge out to any of you out there. So we're going on to the next. We're talking about dikduk and diukim, etc. So here's the following, which last week, the Parshas Vayishlach. So we have a posuk which is got a gap in the middle. You know, they've got the gaps in the Torah. Either they are with a samach in the Chumash, which means that the gap is an enclosed gap, that they're writing the words on either side of the gap. And then you've got psucha, which means that the gap is open till the end of the line. So you've got psuchas and stumos. And we have this pasuk. This is after Rachel had passed away. And then it says that Reuven slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Yisrael, his father, heard. Vayiyu bnei Yaakov shneim also, and the sons of Yaakov were 12. And there's a gap in the middle of a pasuk. So now, and there's a reason for in Chazal. The reason for this is to say that you should first of all to say that the fact that it says Vayiyu bnei Yaakov shneim also, that Reuven was not ostracized for this. You see that he was still considered one of the 12 sons of Yaakov. And that leads us to say that what is described is not to be taken literally. Rather, it means that after his mother passed away and Yaakov had put his bed in Bilhah's tent, and Bilhah was his mother's maid. Sorry, he was Rachel's maid, and Reuven took exception to this, and he felt that now that Rachel's has passed away, the bed of Yaakov should be with his mother, with Leah. And so it was an interference, but not to be taken literally. So that's the background to this. So, but we have here a gap in middle of the pasuk, and so the question is, how is it read? Now let's look carefully. If you want to look at the screen, there's two sets of terop. The tunes are. The first one reads Vayelech Ruven Vayishkav as below Pelegash of Vayishma Yisrael Yuvna Yaakov Shneim. So the second one is Vayelech Ruven Vayishkav as below Pelegash of Vayishma Yisrael Yuvna Yaakov Shneim. So the first one is reading it all in one long pasuk, and the second one is actually dividing into two psukim. So this has been addressed by various medaktikim, and the question was put to me was the following. The Rabbi Yaakov Emden takes the view that when you are reading it b'yochid, you should actually read it with a lower trop, which divides it into two psukim. So the fellow who asked me the question wanted to take it one step further. When it comes to doing Shnayim Mikra v'Echad Targum, should you do the first part and the Targum, and then the second part and the Targum? Now, I must say, no one, with all my research, no one comes up with that extreme an idea. But he's coming from Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and just to remind you, we've talked about in the past, so you've got Rabbi Yaakov Emden publishes his Siddur the year when the Alter Rebbe is born, so he's a generation or more that before the Alter Rebbe, and there's a contemporary of his called Reb Shlomo Zalman Henna, a master medactic, but took the liberty of making huge chidushim also, and so whilst he's brilliant, but his chidushim were not always so popular, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden is the most outspoken critic of Reb Zalman Henna. He published a volume called Luach Eresh, and it's all step-by-step refutations or arguing Reb Zalman Henna. Okay, now the main discussion, the main debate between Reb Zalman Henna and the Rabbi Yaakov Emden is really focusing on the Aseres HaDibros, where the Aseres HaDibros are, let's say, the second one, let's say Shabbos has got 4 psukim. Yet there is what's called the Tam HaElyon, and there's a way that we read it in Shul, and we read them all in one, those 4 psukim in one, as if one long pasuk. Lesitzach, Lesinov, Lesignov, etc. are 4 lois in one pasuk. And yet we don't read them that way. We read them as 4 psukim. And that's because in the Torah there are gaps between the dibros. So you've got 10 dibros, and they are spread over 12 psukim, and some of the dibros are made up of multiple psukim, and some of the dibros are 4 in one pasuk. So Reb Zalman Henna writes a whole 4-page discussion about this, and he says the following. He says that what you have here is like the concept of kri and ksiv. There is the way words are written, and then we have a mesoira, the way those words are meant to be pronounced. Like you have, for example, the word nara. So as you're familiar, this nara is spelled nun ein reish. That's right, and that should be read nar. But the mesoira, the kri is, it's read nara. And there are numerous, I don't want to go into all the details, but there's a way which it's written and the way it is meant to be pronounced, the way it's meant to be read. So that's the kri and the ksiv. So now the Aseres HaDibros, so then okay, so the Aseres HaDibros, we've got all of these gaps, and they are in the script, they are the gaps. One way, very numerous, with breaking up Loisignov into 4, that pasuk into 4 sections, and the other ones you've got the gaps kind of putting 4 psukim into 1 section. That is the ksiv. But then the kri is with the way we have a mesoira, where the pasuk begins, where the pasuk ends, etc. So with Aseres HaDibros, we have what's called in the Chumoshim Tam HaElyon and Tam HaTachton. You could understand that the more dramatic one and the more business as usual one. There's however you want to explain where those titles come from. High pitch, low pitch. The Tam HaElyon is used when we lay in shul. The Tam HaTachten is the one which is when, let's say, you're learning Chumash, you're being Maris Sedra, you use a Tam HaTachten. So this is the way Reb Zalman Henna explains the Aser Sadibris, the reading of Aser Sadibris. Actually, his conclusion, and this is why he's not popular, he actually slams this whole Tam HaElyon, and he says, no, it should be just Tam HaTacht. And we have a rule, we're not allowed to divide psukim other than the way Moshe Rabbeinu divided them, and therefore he kind of dismisses the whole Tam HaElyon. That's got to do with the Ksiv, but we should be doing just the Kri. And of course, that is not the minhag. Some say to do the Tam HaElyon just on Shavuos, and some say no. Whenever we read the Aser Sadibris in Kriyas HaTorah, we're going to use Tam HaElyon. That's indeed our minhag. So this is Yaakov Emden goes to town, slams against Reb Zalman Henna and about it. Now, coming back to our posuk though. So now, according to the ksiv, so we have the posuk Vayelech and Vayehiyu are two separate psukim because there's a gap in between. According to the Kri, they are all one posuk. So what we're seeing here is the Tzibur, we read it the Kri and not the ksiv. Yaakov Emden, he wants to say, yes, in public you should be sticking to the Kri, because we don't want people to hear that Reuven did this and this without hearing the end of the posuk, because the end of the posuk is kind of exonerating Reuven, and to say that he don't take it literally. So therefore we shouldn't be breaking it apart. But when you're learning, when you by Yochid, so you can see here, Avol hayochid she'ein bo chashosh azoi koirei bebechina acheres, and it should be that dividing the pasuk. Now, what you have on the screen is from the Shaila Moira Chumash, and he brings this, and I've seen it in other Chumashim also. They bring this. Okay, so to summarize, the Reb Zalman Henna says, just read it as one pasuk because that's the Kri. Don't worry about the gap which is in the Sefer Torah. That's the Ksiv. Just stick to the Kri. Rabbi Yaakov Emden has said here, in public, do the Kri, but in private, stick to the Ksiv. Now, curiously, he says this is the same as Aser Sadibris, and I'm sorry, it's actually just the opposite, because in Aser Sadibris, we are in public, we are reading the Ksiv, we are respecting the gaps. And it's Afker Fakir, when we're reading on our own, that's when we'll go according to the Kri. But he says it's the same, but fine. Now, the Alter Rebbe brings this whole discussion in Siman Tov Tzadik Daled, the Dinim of Shavuos. And he says how the Aser Sadibris have got two tunes. And what's the reason? Well, the first one is according to the Ksiv, and the second one is the Kri. And he says, really, we should be sticking to the Kri. However, he says, when it comes Shavuos, since it's Shavuos, we are reading in public, it's the day of the giving of Aser Sadibris. Therefore, we read the Aser Sadibris in 10 separate statements as they were said by Har Sinai. So again, in Shavuos, because it's we kind of to replay as Matan Torah, and in Matan Torah there were 10 Dibris, and therefore we're going to go according to the Ksiv, which have them in 10 separate statements. There are those who do so also in Vayisroi and also Vayeschanan, who also do the Tam HaElyon. I don't know if the Alter Rebbe used the word Tam HaElyon, Tam HaTacht, I'm not even sure. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. But then the bottom line is, he says, Rak hayochid hakoire le'atzmoi koirei b'sheni, that if you're learning on your own, you should be sticking to the kri, which, in other words, the way the psukim are divided, not the way the gaps are set out. So therefore, I'm challenging when the Sefer, the Shaila Moira, quoting the Rabbi Yaakov Emden, was saying that the Yochid should divide this pasuk into two, when the Alter Rebbe has said not so. He has said that by Yochid should go according to the Kri and therefore read it as one pasuk, not to have a gap in the middle, and certainly not to stop for the Shnai Mikra. Now, and this is also from the Kaf HaChaim, for quoting a Sefer Beis David, that when you're doing Shnai Mikra, you should read the whole pasuk as it is, and not to be breaking it up. He's talking about the Ereses Adibris, not to be breaking up Leisitzach Leisinov into separate psukim when you're doing Shnai Mikra. One last thing now, the Sefer Luach Eresh of Rabbi Yaakov Emden was reprinted in Tovshin Samach Aleph, and it was published by someone called Reb David Yitzchaki. At the end of the volume, he has several essays on Dikduk, and he addresses, and the two tunes for the story with Reuven, and he identifies them as a machloikus marvoi umadin choi, the difference between the west and the east, and the Tam Ha'elyon is from the west, and the Tam HaTachton is from the east. And so you have here the west has it all in one pasuk, and the east has it broken up into two psukim. Just to help you get your geography right, you've got in your Bovel and Eretz Yisrael. So Eretz Yisrael is west in relation to Bovel. So you've got here two schools, west and east, or Bovel and Eretz Yisrael. And it says the following, that generally we follow the west, and therefore we should only be having the Tam Ha'elyon, and he does away with the whole breaking apart into two psukim, and that's how he passes. And so we have here, although Rabbi Yaakov Emden does tell us to break it up into two psukim and to respect the Tam HaTachta, so to speak, but we're seeing here that the publisher, who really seems to be, he idolizes Rabbi Yaakov Emden in the main Sefer, but here, nevertheless, he disagrees with it. So, all right. For some people, this is fascinating. For some people, absolutely boring, I know. But yes, we're going to go on. So let's get some action here. So someone went into a shop, American call it a store, and somehow he knocked over a bottle of wine. And it's got a tiled floor, as you can see, so beautifully illustrated. So the bottle smashed. So now here's the question: is the customer liable to pay or not? So my first reaction was, every child knows, Odom muad li'olam. A person is always cautioned to be careful, and you have ben oyer ben yoshin. Even if you're asleep, if you lay down and there was something fragile near you, and then in your sleep you rolled over and you smashed the thing, so you are liable to pay, even though you were asleep when you rolled over, because you have to you have to be careful. So that was my first reaction. But then I'm looking around a bit more, and I saw the following. This isn't a Sefer Knei Boisim, actually from Rav Meir Brandsdorf. I met him Gan Eden, where it was about 30 years ago, in Yerushalayim. So he was asked the following. Someone asked his friend, Reuven is going to sleep, and he says to Shimon, do me a favor, and this time, come and wake me. So Reuven, before he went to sleep, he took his glasses off, and he put them on the floor next to his bed. Shimon, at the given time, comes along and wakes up Reuven, and meanwhile he treads on the glasses and smashes them. So now Reuven and Shimon come to the Rav, And does Shimon have to pay for breaking Reuven's glasses? And he says, no, he does not have to pay because, and this is where we're going to read the Din in Shulchan Aruch, that if someone left, here's in Shulchan Aruch, you can see in Tikvah Mishpat of Yud Beis, if someone left a jug in the street and another person passes by and tripped over it and broke the jug, the tripper doesn't have to pay because, and here's the punchline. It's not normal for people to be eyeing the floor as they walk through the street. Not only that, if Mr. Tripper hurt himself on the broken jug, actually Mr. Jug has to pay Mr. Tripper compensation for the damage. So, so here we have, although, as I said, although a person's always has to be careful, but if someone left something in a public place, and I'm using the word public, you can see here that the Knei Boisim is talking about even the case of the fellow who with the glasses, and obviously that bed wasn't in the street, and still he did apply the rule that it's a person's not expected to be checking the floor as they walk through the street, and therefore they're potter. So now I'm not paskening Lemaisa because we have here it's not so clear. I mean, I think this is pretty asking for trouble position for their bottles of wine because it's not mamish on the floor, but I think if you had a heavy coat and you turned around, it's very likely you'd knock over a bottle of wine. And so I think it's quite careless, for want of a milder word, for the shop to be putting their wine so close to the floor that it's so easy for them to be knocked over by a passerby. But the shopkeeper might insist that actually it's high enough to be safe. So then there's going to be a din Torah over the bottle of wine. Or so you might consider if he wants the guy to come back again to let him off. But right, but there are grounds if it is so low that it's likely for them to be knocked over by someone who didn't notice, then there's the ground to say they don't have to pay. Right, let's move on. That's the bottle of wine. Okay, so we have here number 9 on our list. Several men missed laning at Mincha on Shabbos. May they lane after Mincha. So, what is the question? The question is like this. We have Kriyas HaTorah on Shabbos, and then we have on Mondays and Thursdays. That was a takona of Ezra, so that you shouldn't go 3 days without Kriyas HaTorah. What was the institution of reading the Torah on Shabbos afternoon at Mincha? There are people who are Yoshvei Kronos, they're not the shul goers on a daily basis. So at least they should have the Kriyas HaTorah at Shabbos Mincha. I'm not sure why they weren't there at Shacharis, I don't remember. But this is the question that perhaps the laning at Mincha is not so not such a strong chiyuv, and therefore they wouldn't be able to do it other than in the context of tefillah. So I did quite a bit of research. I'm sorry I don't have everything on the screen. And my first reaction is the following. What about Kriyas HaTorah on on Mincha of Yom Kippur? Now, Rabbi Kiva Eger, who lived about 200 years ago, says when he was in a city called Friedland, somewhere in Germany, I think, and it was common that people would make a during the break between Musaf and Mincha, so people would take a Sefer Torah to a side room, and they would do a Kriyas HaTorah there. I'm told that there's someone in 770 who does this every year. He sells Mafta Yona. He does 1 million after the other. He makes a lot of money for his Chabad house by selling Mafta Yonas during the break in 770. So someone wants to get a bargain Mafta Yona. So he takes the Sefer Torah to a side room and makes a minion there. So 200 years ago, they were doing that. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger talks about the Kaddish. So normally after Kriyas HaTorah, we have a Kaddish. At Mincha, we don't do a Kaddish because we have the Kaddish at the beginning of Shemon Esrei. But here you're doing just a minyan for Kriyas HaTorah without Mincha. So he says you should say Kaddish. Where should you say Kaddish? It's another thing. You should say the Kaddish after Haftorah. Actually, Rabbi Akiva Eiger has a problem with our minhag, which is the widespread minhag on Shachris of Tisha B'Av. Why is Kaddish said after Kriyas HaTorah, before Haftorah? Because on regular Tanis, you don't interrupt between the Shlishi and the Haftorah. It's only when on Shabbos, Yom Tov, where you've got your quota of aliyahs in before the Kaddish, you finish your quota, say a Kaddish, and then you do the maftir afterwards. But when the last aliyah is part of the quota, then there shouldn't be a Kaddish said there. That's a separate problem. But meanwhile, there you see that there is Kriyas HaTorah, an independent Kriyas HaTorah, not related to Mincha. And so on that basis, the Piskei Teshuvos, he doesn't bring this proof, but he does say it's okay to do a mincha. People missed the Kriyas HaTorah at mincha. It's okay for them to do a separate Kriyas HaTorah after mincha. And it's not the fact that it's not in the within the framework of tefillah, that doesn't matter. Now listen to this. As I left the Beis Horah on Friday, I got a message from someone who runs a yeshiva somewhere in Europe, and it's one day Hanukkah, and it's the day where the boys are able to go home for a few days for a break, and a lot of the boys will have to leave the yeshiva, they leave the premises early, so they won't be able to daven with a minyan. It's because they have to leave so early, but they are asking, davening, they can daven later. But can they do Kriyas HaTorah before davening, before they leave? So I've just gone through this whole thing about is Kriyas HaTorah has to be part of davening, or can it be a standalone? So having gone through this whole thing, I was able to tell him it's okay for them to do Kriyas HaTorah then, although some are not so happy about doing Kriyas HaTorah before davening. Sefer called Kinyan Torah, but come to Lubavitcher Shul the Shabbos before Yud Shvat, the Shabbos before Gimel Tammuz, and you'll see plenty of minyanim happening before davening. So somehow in Lubavitch we do see the Kriyas HaTorah as a not so strongly bound to the davening. It's a separate thing, and so I told them it's okay. Right, now our last thing is someone I met in Eretz Yisrael when I was there last year, and whilst I was there, it was just after the Siddur had been published, and I arranged an interview somehow to promote the sales, and Baruch Hashem, the Siddur is sold out in Eretz Yisrael. We have to work on a new edition, a new print. But meanwhile, he says that in your interview, he writes to me, you mentioned that the Alter Rebbe introduced the Ketores, the mention of Ketores in the prayer they send at the end of davening, at the end of Korbanos. So on your screen, you've got from two Siddurim, which was shortly before the Alter Rebbe's times, the Shalosh Siddur, Tov Kuf Beis, and the Yaakov Emden Siddur from Tov Kuf Hey. And you can see here, Atasi V'Sonu Lahakiv Korban Atomid B'Mayadoi. And here again, Atasi V'Korban Atomid B'Mayadoi, and the Yehirotzen should be Ki'ilu He crowned the Korban Atomid B'Mayadoi. Right, now, the Alter Rebbe had introduced here Haktoris Bismano, and it has Ke'ilu crown the Korban Atomid v'Hiktarnu Haktoris. The reason for this change is because the original Ashkenaz did not have Nusach Ashkenaz did not have saying Ketores every morning, and therefore the prayer says we brought Korban Atomid. That's what is the Parshas Atomid. They didn't do saying Ketores on a daily basis. But once the Alter Rebbe is importing from Nusach Sfard, etc., that saying Ketores every day is standard, therefore you have to upgrade this Loshen, instead of just mentioning Korban Atomid, you also have to mention the Ketairis. Has 3 times in this tefillah. This is from Tov Tzadik Base print, but 3 times in this tefillah, the Alter Rebbe upgrades, and he says Tomid Atomid Moedel Hakdak Teiris Bismano. Yeah. Now, before I forget, in Rav Ashkenazi's Sefer Sharit Philo Minig, he asks the question, why is Tomid b'moyadoi and Ktoiros is bismano? I did not have a chance to read his answer. That's typical for Rav Ashkenazi to pick up in these, and he has these fascinating explanations. I would just say it's style, but he's got much deeper explanations than that. But coming back to so this is where the Alter Rebbe had introduced. What I find fascinating, or no, that's not the right word, is that this tefillah of Ribono Shel Olamim, which is kind of the wrap up of Korbanos of the morning, is mentioned in the Tur, in Siman Mem Ches. Now, the fellow who asked me the question, he says he's taken several Siduri Ashkenaz, and this tefillah is not there. And he's actually right. I took out the Redelheim Siddur, I took out Rav Schonfeld Siddur, and another German Siddur, Avodas Yisrael, and they don't have this tefillah altogether. Whereas, as you can see, this is Shalom is also Nusach Ashkenaz, Rabbi Yaakov is also Nusach Ashkenaz, and they do have it. So this I don't have an answer. If you have a tefillah which is mentioned already in the Tur, and it's brought down in the Ramo in Siman Mem Ches, he mentions this. Mishnah Berurah doesn't say a word of that. Some Kehillas don't say this tefillah. So I am intrigued why it was dropped in some Nusach Ashkenaz Sidurim, but you can see here that amongst Nusach Ashkenaz seems to be somehow the Germanic from the Western Europe Nuschos seem to have dropped it for some reason, which I don't know, whereas more Eastern Europe Nuschos do have it, and the Alter Rebbe then upgraded it that it should also include that's what I have to share with you for this evening, and thank you for joining us. I wish you a good tavoch. We should have Suras Tevis, Al Hanovi, should be Mevasa de Geula, Aidei Moshiach Tzedkeinu, Meheiru Yameinu Mamash. Good tavoch.
Good